Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to be talking about using the moral argument to prove God's existence in real life situations. And the thing about real life situations is you're going to be talking with real people in some kind of context, and you have come prepared, you've thought about this, you've wrestled with the idea, maybe agonized over possible objections or the concept, and it's very unfair to think that you're going to come in and just prove, all of this and help someone see all of this on the spot. They're going to need time. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give what I find to work as sort of a real life, example. I've given this argument before, and I've seen the kind of things that people say, and what I find is the best thing to do is just to kind of state the argument and then wait for someone to object, because they'll object very quickly. They usually have already thought about this and they already have an objection and they think it's great when it's really bad. And what your job is really just to get them to see the flaw in their objection and to get them to slow down. And they're going to need to take time later on after you're gone to really think about this, and they need to agonize over the idea and really wrestle with it. But all you're trying to do is to get them to start wrestling. So you've got to give them something. So what I would do, I think the best thing to do is to state the syllogism. And the syllogism, objective moral values and duties exist only if God exists, premise 1. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists. Now this is technically a valid syllogism, but if people hear the word valid, they think that you're go ahead and you're not going to, that's it, so they get hung up on the word valid. So maybe don't even bother with the word valid. I would just state the syllogism, and then I would define the terms. So define the term objective, subjective, and moral values and moral duties. Alright, so objective means that it's real regardless of what anyone thinks, and subjective means it has no reality beyond people's minds. So another way to think of subjective just means an idea, purely an idea, or like a fantasy, or just imagination. So for example, Bigfoot exists subjectively because it exists in people's minds, but there's no hard evidence that would demonstrate that he exists to someone who doesn't want to believe in Bigfoot. So if you found a Bigfoot skeleton, or they located a herd of Bigfoots living in the woods, then that would be objective, that something that exists regardless of what anyone thinks. Okay. So I would say just, define your terms, and then the other terms you need to define is moral values and moral duties. A moral duty is something that you have to do, and it's immoral for you not to do it. And then a moral value is something that is good to do, but you don't necessarily have to do it. So you have a moral duty not to steal from the store. It's wrong for you to steal from the store. But let's say you want to become a school teacher, that has moral value. Or alternatively, you could become a computer scientist, and that would also have moral value. So, or a computer programmer, I guess. But those are two, you don't have to do them, but they're good to do. Okay. So then let's just go down the list of defeaters, and just a very quick response to kind of get them thinking. You need to understand how to defeat their position better than you're going to have time to explain to them in real life. So one of the most common objection you're going to get from young people is just to boldly claim that morality is subjective. Young people tend to think they know more than they know. And that's just part of being young. Okay, I was the same way. We're all the same way. So morality is subjective, and they may say that it is subjective by definition, or something like that. So whenever the basic thing to do whenever they say that morality is subjective, I would say you do what's called the example test. So the simple example can be just slavery. So you could say, all right, is the idea that slavery was a moral evil, is that just a subjective fantasy? And see, what I like to do is say subjective fantasy, where I'm using the word fantasy combined with subjective to help reinforce the idea of what we're talking about, because people don't know what the term subjective means. So I always say subjective fantasy, and sometimes they won't agree with your definition there. We'll get to that objection in a minute. But most of the time you give the example test. If you have more time, I would say, all right, begin with the Hindu practice of sati. So like the Hindu practice of sati, widows were expected to jump on the funeral fire with their dead husbands, or else they didn't really love their husbands. Do you think that the idea that is evil and wrong? Do you think that idea of the evil of that practice is purely a subjective fantasy, and that there's nothing wrong with it? And you might follow up with like, do you think there's nothing wrong with doing that? Okay. They may say that it's okay, so you can kind of go to greater and greater extremes. You can go to the murder of babies. Do you think the murder of babies is objectively evil, or is the idea of it being evil just a subjective fantasy? In other words, is it really wrong? Okay. If they think that's okay, the final one you can go for is what about how the Nazis rounded up all the homosexuals they could find in their concentration camps and killed them. And that one will actually get young people, because for some reason they're kind of numb to a wide variety of things. But it's like, well, what about homosexuals? And then they're very sensitive to evils against homosexuals. So that tends to resonate. Okay, so let's go on down to the next one. People will say that you don't need to believe in God to know how to be a good person. Now, this person has not listened to your argument at all. They heard you start the argument and they already thought they knew a response to you. So what they're doing is they're simply affirming for you the truth of the second premise. And the second premise is that objective moral values and duties exist. So this person who says this, that I don't need to believe in God to know how to be a good person, this person is fundamentally disagreeing with the other person who says it's subjective. Okay? Because they're saying, oh no, I know objective good and objective evil. They might not be comfortable with the terms, but like you can just use their terms, like if they don't like the term evil or something like that, So what I would do is just, what we'll notice is like the best thing to do is to just ask questions. So just ask them, what did I say exactly? Did I say you had to be religious to be good, or did I say there can be no such thing as good and evil unless God exists? Okay. And you might ask them like, you might say like, hey, you just agreed with my second premise. Do you agree with my first premise? You might put it like that. Okay. But this person hasn't even, so you just got to get them, asking questions help people slow down and think. Okay. Now, another one you get, I've heard this one many times, is that morality is subjective. Okay, so we're back on the subjective train. Different cultures have had different morals. Okay. So, they'll bring up lots of examples a lot of times, like how in 2000 BC they thought slavery was okay, and today we think it's not. Okay. All right. What they're doing is they're saying because humans have disagreed about something, then humans are just making it up, and there's no objective reality to it. Well, that's obviously not true. So what I do is bring up a counterexample. In 2000 BC, they thought the Earth was flat. Today, it's generally believed to be round or spherical. Okay. Does the fact that people disagreed on this mean that they're just making up their views as subjective fantasies? Okay. Now, a lot of people are going to repeat their position over and over again before they really listen to you, so you may have to repeat your question. And it may be confusing because you think like, oh, they just gave a response, when in reality they didn't respond to you, they just repeated their original point. So always be careful to watch out for thoughtless responses where they just repeat themselves with different words, but it's the same idea, and just keep repeating your point until they actually respond to it. So like, does the fact that people disagreed on the shape of the earth mean that they're just making up the whole thing as a subjective fantasy, or is it objectively real, or at least they're pursuing what they have good evidence for, All right. Now, another one you might get is that people will raise the problem of evil in response to this, and they'll say that a good God cannot exist because evil exists. And now, if the problem of evil is raised, then this is an emotionally charged question. You really have to very quickly get them to slow down and think. And so what I would say is, this is the question that seems to always do the trick. Okay, just ask them, if you were God, would you remove all human freedom to choose to be evil or good? Let's say you're God. What would you do? And in that situation, especially atheists love human freedom. It is one of the greatest virtues to them, and they're never going to say, oh, let's do away with human freedom. And so that will, they're probably wanting to, they tend to just stop communicating with you online if you say this. But what they're going to be forced to do is to say, like, well, I guess there would be some evil in the world because I wouldn't take away human freedom to choose to be good or evil. And that's really the most important freedom. But, that tends to be the way to go with that. Now, they might say, so let's move on to the next one, number 5. They might say that morality is just created by evolution. Okay, so, like, what they're in effect saying is that, like, if you see someone, like murdering a baby, and you have this like strong internal urge to stop this from happening, that is just something that's been programmed into you by evolution. Okay, well, what that would mean is that, like, morality is really an illusion. It's not a subjective fantasy, but it's just an illusionary byproduct of programming. And it's not real. You could have evolved another way, and it would be something else entirely. So, like, if we had evolved from, say, hive bees, then fertile females would fight each other to death, and we would think that was morally okay. Or if we had evolved from alligators, then, like, fathers would eat the slowest and weakest children, and we would think that was okay. Okay, so a lot of the time, the people who raise this objection haven't really asked themselves, well, like, does that mean that morality is objectively real or not? So sometimes you might have to ask them, are you rejecting the first premise of my argument or the second premise? Okay, because a lot of times they think they're rejecting the first premise, but when in reality they're usually objecting to the second premise. And if they're objecting to the second premise, you can do the test again. You can just say, like, okay, what about this? What about this? Do you think this is objectively evil? Okay. It may be better to just kind of refute the idea of morality being an illusion. So, like, you can just explain what the moral sense is. So you can say, like this. I see, let's say you see a baby being murdered. You have this internal sense that that's wrong and you need to stop it. Okay, if that internal sense is just produced by evolution, then it's really just an illusion. And there's nothing, you just happen to have evolved that way. You could have evolved in another way. And you didn't really evolve in the right way or the wrong way. That's just the way you evolved. In other words, like, what you want to work into the statement is, like, we didn't evolve in the way we should have evolved. It's just the way we happen to have evolved. Okay, so some sort of way of wording that. Okay, and then just bring up the question, well, if evolution can make the moral sense an illusion, then what about the other senses? And what you'll realize, what'll come up is, like, well, I guess if it can make that something, and they may say that, the morality is kind of secondary, whereas, like, things like vision and hearing are primary. But in reality, morality is very fundamental. So, like, it's every bit as central to life. You can't really live life without a sense of better and worse and good and bad, you know. So, just ask them that, you know, can it make our other senses an illusion? Because if that bat swings both ways, you know, like if it can make morality an illusion, it can make the other senses an illusion. And then the question becomes like, I don't know if the justification really outweighs just the fact that, like, if I look over there and I see something, I believe it to be over there. That's a pretty strong evidence that I have, just my sight and my hearing in general. That would be really weird for a theory like evolution, which is ultimately based on the use of the senses, because that's what scientists do. They observe data and then reason. It wouldn't make sense for evolution to refute that, you know. Now, what I'm talking about is Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, but you don't want to necessarily break down the whole argument. You just kind of want to get them started. Now, they may say that morality is subjective because it cannot be empirically verified, and the thing to do there probably is to just go down the test of, like, okay, what about sati? What about murder of infants? What about Nazi execution of homosexuals? Or what about slavery? Are you saying that there's nothing really wrong with these things? Okay. What they're doing is they're bringing up verificationism, and they're saying that, like, the only things we can really know to be true are things that can be verified by the senses. All right, so this is, you know, people will jump around, you know, but, like, they're saying that, well, the only things that can be true will be things that can be verified by the senses, and so that's the verification principle. The only true knowledge is knowledge that can be verified by the senses: sight, hearing, touch, etc. And so the problem with the verification principle is that it's self-contradictory. So, you know, you would ask them, well, how do you empirically verify that you can trust empiricism? You know, they may say empiricism and they may not say the verification principle or something like that. But it may be best not to go that route with that one and just give them the test. Okay. Now, number 6 is, number 7, they may say something like slavery or murder of infants or, you know, the Holocaust or something like that. They'll say it's subjectively wrong. And they may even go so far as to say, point the finger at you, that you don't understand the difference between objective and subjective. Okay, so the problem you have here is that people will they will believe in subjective morality when it suits them, and then they'll believe in objective morality when that suits them. Okay? But then they'll say it's all subjective, but when in reality, part of the time it's objective and part of the time it's subjective. Okay, so when you're, you know, talking about a situation, there are some situations in life that are gray areas, and there's some that are more obvious. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the bottom line is, they don't really know what those terms mean, and they use them all the time like they do, and they haven't thought about what they really mean. Okay, and they very likely will tell you don't know what they mean, which probably is just psychological projection. So what I would do is just define the terms again and ask them if they agree, you know. So, like, just say, all right, subjective means it has no reality outside of you, the person. And then objective means it's true regardless of what anyone thinks. Do you agree with those definitions of terms? Okay, so, like, it doesn't really matter if they agree with those definitions of terms. You can just say, well, let's just use those definitions for our discussion. Do you believe in subjective or objective morality? You know, you know. But, like, in reality, that if they're that confused about this, that's probably end of conversation at this point, because they just need to go home and think about it, because they got a lot on their plate, you know. So, you know. And then the last one is people will bring up gray areas. They'll bring up gray areas of morality where it's not real clear what the right or wrong thing to do is. And they'll say because there's gray areas, then nobody really has any real objective knowledge about morality. Okay, they usually won't even give you an example of a gray area, but they'll just say it's not black and white, it's shades of gray. they're probably thinking along the lines of something like homosexuality. You know, that people get very offended and they want to say like, oh, we don't know if it's right or wrong, or, you know, some people think it's wrong and some people think it's okay, and who's to say who's right? You know, it's all just subjective, you know, something like that. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to bring up a not gray area. Okay. The problem is in their thinking that the moral sense works very much like our other senses. You know, if I was to try to see something that's very far away, say the little go-kart that the astronauts left on the moon, my sense of sight has a very hard time seeing that. Okay? Whereas if I was to hold an apple in front of my face, I think I could tell whether or not there was an apple directly in front of my face. Okay? Because it's close. So the sense of sight can see into difficult situations, but it can't see into... It can't see into difficult ones, but it can see into, you know, right in front of you ones. So like with morality, you can give them an example. Like, let's say you're a nurse and a patient has had a heart attack. Okay, he wakes up. He asks you if he's had a heart attack. Okay, do you tell him that he's had a heart attack? But that may send him back into cardiac arrest. Or do you tell him, do you lie to him? But the thing is, he has a right to know what's going on with his own body. You know, so like if you, the nurse or the doctor, starts just doing what you want with other people's bodies without their permission, without their knowledge, then you become some sort of Nazi doctor who just experimenting on people without their choice, you know. But at the same time, if you tell him the truth and you give him knowledge about what you're doing with his body, then like he could go, but he could die. So that's a very much gray area, okay. But there are other situations. So like the thing to do maybe is don't bring up the gray moral area, because they may just want to debate that, you know, especially young people that just want to debate that. So the thing to do might be to just say, hey, okay, there's stuff that's far away that's hard to see, and there's stuff that's up close that's easy to see. So let me give you an up close example with morality, and then go back down your example list. Okay, and you just kind of removed their doubt. You know, just because there's gray areas, it doesn't mean there's not also clear areas. And so, I mean, that's really kind of it. Like, I wouldn't bother with going into it anymore. I think that, like, when it comes to giving the moral argument in real life, you might not want to do any more than that. The only thing that I found that's helpful is to point out there is a logical problem with subjective morality, and sometimes that it works to bring that up. So what you can do is you can say, okay, why did humans make up morality in the first place when they didn't think it was either good or evil to make up? And if they didn't think it was either good or evil to make it up, then why even make it up at all? Why make up the idea of good when you don't think anything is either good or bad? You know, and that is more of a logical problem, and logical problems require people have to think about it a little more, but sometimes that, you know, that works better. And like, you could give more knockdown, hard-nosed defense of this argument, but hey, this is probably good enough. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time. Quick tip to add in here. In the course of discussion and debate about the moral argument, the other person is going to probably, especially if they're young, on the one hand, they're going to almost certainly be rejecting the second premise and probably claiming that morality is subjective. But on the other hand, out of the other side of their mouth, they're going to be congratulating themselves for being very smart and rational, and they're probably going to criticize you for being irrational or dishonest, or, you know, they might call you racist, you know, they might call you weak because you need religion to be moral or something like that. The thing is, whenever they reject the second premise, but out of the other side of their mouth criticize you, you know, that's a great opportunity for you to say, like, okay, well, you know, if I'm so irrational, then why is that a bad thing, since nothing is really immoral or evil, you know, or something like that. Now, they may try to turn around and say, oh, it's not a matter of morality, or something like that, and try to water down the language, semantically, to try to slip out of it. So you can make it harder to slip out of it by just saying, well, how do we know that being irrational isn't the morally superior way to live, or something like that, or if I want to believe that, why do you think there's anything wrong with that, that kind of thing, So why do you have, basically the idea is, why do you have a problem with me being dishonest or irrational since you say that no action is wrong? So anyway, that can be that's almost certainly going to come up. And the thing is, you really want them to confront the reality of the sense experience of morality.